The choice to bring new life into the world is one of the most profound decisions we can make. Most people believe that having children allows us to experience the joys of nurturing new life and watching a small being grow into a fully formed person. It speaks to our innate desire for human connection, legacy, and to contribute to something greater than ourselves. But some believe that bringing someone new into the world necessarily exposes them to suffering and harm, and that this very act is morally unconscionable. This view is known as antinatalism. Lawrence Anton, a fellow YouTuber and antinatalist, accepted my invitation to discuss this topic in depth. In our talk, we dove deep into the antinatalist perspective. Some of my questions were, what truly motivates someone to hold this position? Is there any common ground with more mainstream views on childbearing? And most fundamentally, is it even reasonable to hold such a position? My own position, put simply, is that having kids is good, but if you're going to have children, then do it right. I prefer never to tear something down without offering something positive in its place, and because I spend my conversation with Lawrence mostly questioning and criticizing the antinatalist perspective, I wrote down my ideas on my positive vision for what it means to have kids right and published them as my Responsible Natalism Manifesto at havekidsright.com. If you're interested in this topic, then I encourage you to give it a visit. I believe that part of learning to think better is to practice having civil conversations with people you do not agree with and striving to find as much common ground as you can. I think my conversation with Lawrence is a great example of such a conversation on one of life's eternal topics, the blessings and burdens of creating new life. And if you appreciate this sort of content, then please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and share this video with someone you think would find it useful. And so with that, here's my conversation with Lawrence Anton. Lawrence Anton, welcome to Beware of Wolf. I've been looking forward to having you on for a little while now. We met on X, and I saw some tweets related to antinatalism, and actually the person I was speaking with said, hey, if you actually want to interview somebody, Lawrence might be a good person. So I reached out to you and you agreed. So I'm really happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So please introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about yourself and then a little bit more about antinatalism specifically, and then how you came to that.
Yeah, so an intro to me, I was born and raised in London, still live here. I'm sort of, I have no formal education in ethics or philosophy or anything like that, but I'm just very interested as a layperson in ethics, and I enjoy putting my opinions out there and seeing what other people have to say, hence the YouTube channel. I'm mostly, even though my channel is just really about antinatalism, I'm also vegan as well and have strong beliefs about that. So those are my two sort of, areas that I like to speak about. In terms of how I came to antinatalism, and then I'll go on to, what I understand it to be. So I actually came to it from overhearing a conversation. I was in Sweden at the time, and I overheard some people having a conversation. And I was talking to a guy who knew one of the people having that conversation, and they said, one of the guys in that conversation said something that he said something along the lines of like, "Oh yeah, because having children is wrong," or something like to that effect. And I'd never heard this before, and I had, I had the opposite point of view, but it's not really a topic I'd really put any sort of serious thought into. I was, I think I was 20 or 21 at the time. And I asked the guy who I was speaking with, what is that guy talking about? And he said, "Oh, don't forget about it. He's just an antinatalist." So I then heard the term, and then I again, a couple months later, met some antinatalists who I actually already knew. I just didn't know they were antinatalists. They explained it to me. I watched some interviews off the back of that, and I then, it was a position that I found really interesting, and I tried to, counter and think of good rebuttals, and I personally couldn't find any. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to adopt it as part of my, one of my ethical principles. So that's how I came to it. So how I actually view it, the way I see antinatalism is there's two parts of it. The first part is that there's this sort of pessimistic evaluation. And when I say pessimistic, I don't mean it in the colloquial sense of being overly negative. I mean it in the philosophical sense of sort of, to me, it's an understanding that the world is much worse than most people probably understand. And that pessimistic evaluation of life is a recognition that there is a lot of harm that people come to, a lot of suffering that happens, and ultimately there's death as well. And attached to that is the sort of moral judgment that therefore it is wrong to bring new beings into existence, because obviously you are then, essentially conscripting them to an existence that contains many bad things. And I would say that is probably without going into the arguments for it now, unless you want me to now, but
no, just go ahead and state the actual kind of view,
Cool.
and then we'll kind of discuss it, the details.
Well, yeah, that's basically it, really. There are several arguments for that center around different aspects of antinatalism, or different sort of, they emphasize different things that lead to it. But in terms of the actual position, that's it, basically.
Yeah. And part of what interests me about your journey is that, not only were you kind of personally taken by this view, but you also decided to create a YouTube channel around it. And, I watched a couple of your interviews with people who don't agree, and watch you, kind of some of your solo videos where you're kind of defending certain views about it. So I think I have a decent understanding of where you're coming from. But the fact is, you personally felt compelled to kind of make this part of your life purpose, is to actually talk about why it's morally problematic for people to choose to have children. Is that accurate? And what would you say is it in you that drove you to, that kind of outreach?
Well, when I grew up, I was, for all intents and purposes, a relatively I never know what the best way to say this is, but I was, in terms of my views and the way I behaved and all this sort of stuff, I was a very normal, wouldn't stand out type of person. And I lived in Sweden for a period doing an exchange there as part of my university program. And when I was out in Sweden, I became vegan as a result of, long story short, I'd never really been exposed to animals before, and I lived with a dog for the first time and found myself forming a friendship with this dog. And then I sort of made the connection of, well, if I'm able to form this friendship with this dog, then surely pigs, cows, chickens, fish, given that they all feel pain as well, I don't feel like I should be, contributing to intentionally harming them. And so that really, for me, that was just like a complete paradigm shift when I became vegan. It sort of made me realize that the world that I knew there were things that were wrong in the world, but I'd never realized that there was something of that scale. Because, when it comes to animals being killed, we're talking trillions, every year. And I just had this, compulsion to do something about it. And so I started doing street outreach to try and convince other people to become vegan. And just from that, I've evolved into, well, not I've evolved, but my personal feeling for where I want my life to go is to try and essentially, well, it's, it sounds very cliche and stuff, but essentially leave the world a better place than when I found it. As my actions are concerned.
I think that's completely fair. I mean, I'd love to do the same thing in my small way. That's a fairly common human impulse, is to want to pass on a better world than it was when we found it. So I totally respect that.
Yeah, no, 100%. And then just to round off, when I became antinatalist, that was a new way that I saw I could do good in the world. That, trying to convince other people not to bring someone else into it, or, there are other methods of antinatalist activism that I think people can do, and we can get into that if you're interested. But essentially, I think that to make the world a better place, we can bring less individuals into it, and the ones who are brought into it, we make their lives go as well as possible. And yeah, that was why I really started doing this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously I hear, points that we would agree on, and part of my basis for conversation is always to find as many points of common ground as possible. I mean, obviously, I think we easily agree that the people who are here should be able to live the best life possible, and I think where we might come into friction is the inherent ethics or the ethical choice to bring new people into existence, to procreate, to have children, and so one thing you said that I found interesting was you said that part of antinatalism is kind of a pessimistic evaluation. And you said, I think you said the world is worse than most people understand. And I mean, I think a lot of people do understand the world is a pretty rough place in some ways, and I think a lot of people, not everybody, some people lead truly miserable lives, and so I'm never going to dispute that the life is a mix. But I think most people, would. It's like everybody says they're better than average driver, so it's like, and obviously that can't be true, but in I think many people would say, yeah, they have a pretty good idea of how bad the world is. And you're saying that the world is worse than most people understand. So I'm curious if you want to unpack that a little bit and tell me how you come to that kind of understanding that's more kind of rare, that the world is worse than most people understand.
Yeah, well, there's different sort of aspects of it we can come at. So there's there's different scopes to the answer, right? So there's the scope of an individual person's life, but then there's the scope of the general human project. Our species so far, and in the current day, how well has that gone? But then there's also an even wider scope in general of, well, just life generally, and that includes human and non-human. How well is that going? Now, when it comes to antinatalism, the most sort of pertinent scope is probably to talk about the life of the individual, right? Which obviously there's going to be massive variation. I think it is also important to talk about how well humanity in general has gone, because there are two sort of categories of argument for antinatalism. And if anyone can come up with better labels for these categories, then please send them over. But for the moment, they're called like the philanthropic and the misanthropic arguments. The philanthropic really concern, not bringing someone into existence out of concern for that individual who you would be creating.
Right.
The misanthropic are the harm that individual will do, right? And I think the misanthropic argument is where how well has humanity in general gone as a project? How I think that fits into the misanthropic. So if we just cover that one first, and then I'll come back to the individual life. So when it comes to how well humanity has gone, if you think about all of the bad things that have happened to or have been done by humanity throughout history, it seems relatively clear to me that there's been much more bad than there has good. So if we think about, very sort of infamous things like, conquest, empire, the Jewish Holocaust, you got the Armenian Holocaust, what the Belgians did in the Free State, and there are many, many other things, people can label throughout history, slavery generally. It seems to me that it would be pretty hard to identify good things in human history that are as good as those things are bad. I think a lot of people would find it pretty unpalatable to say that they can identify things that have been as good as something like, the Holocaust perpetuated or carried out by the Nazis. And so it seems relatively clear to me that even if you really lay out human history and the general human project to the average person, it would probably be, even if they're not antinatalists, it'd be quite hard for them to say, I think, that there has been more good than bad. And then another thing to say is that often the good things that we can point to, they are often simply us solving problems that we created in the first place. And often we create them by simply just continuing the species. So yeah, if you have anything to say on that, I'm happy to get into that. Or I can just go.
I'd also I'd like to hear your treatment of the philanthropic side, and then kind of go a little bit deeper into that, into them, together.
Yeah, sure. So that's sort of humanity generally. That sort of fits into the misanthropic argument. When we come to the philanthropic argument, we're really talking about the life of the individual person. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, my life is different to your life, is different to, you know, someone in Mumbai to someone in Kenya, etc., etc. We all have different lives, so you can't talk about every single person's life. But if we talk about the best lives that people generally have, you know, people who are in affluent countries, they have, you know, pretty ample access to resources, modern medicine, sanitation, all this sort of stuff.
Like you and me.
Yeah, exactly. So whilst I do not deny that many people, as they experience their lives, will say, you know, I've enjoyed my life, and even when they get on their deathbed, they can look back and say, you know, I have enjoyed my life. And I would even put myself in that category. I think it's, I do enjoy my life at the moment. That, you know, that doesn't mean it's going to continue that way. Often the things that do go wrong in old age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, decrepitude, as they call it in the life extension movement, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But if we just sort of have a sort of, I'll give like sort of like a shotgun spread of different things that I think are, you know, are really bad in our lives. And people, I think, often underestimate them because they either have not gone through them themselves or they haven't gone through them yet, right? Because often when you ask someone, you know, if you enjoy their life, if you enjoy your life, just given the fact that most people are not of old age, right? Just because, you know, old age is only a section of the population. Most people haven't actually experienced a lot of the bad things. So if we just cover a few, you've got cancer, at least even in the developed world, many people get that.
Sure.
Heart disease, dementia, Alzheimer's, cluster headaches, all these sorts of things that we would all recognize as sort of, you know, very bad, and are pretty common, even in the first world. You know, I've got a family member dying of cancer now, but a family friend just died of cancer. And, you know, I've known a few people just in my immediate vicinity, and this is in a country that has, you know, some of the best healthcare in the world, ample access to resources, all of this sort of thing. So there's many things that many of us will be exposed to that are very bad, things like cancer, that sort of stuff. But even on the more trivial sort of side of things, many of the desires that people have go either unmet or they are met, and then they what's it called? Not retrograde, but they're only temporarily met. So, for example,
like winning the lottery but being miserable in the end, kind of thing.
Well, it's not even that. It's even more just like simple things. So,
That's an extreme case for sure. Yeah. But
yeah. But we spend much of our lives in a state of pursuing something that once we get, we have some temporary pleasure from it, or even some extended pleasure. But often we will habituate to that.
So the hedonic treadmill is kind of what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And so even if our lives go well, we spend much of the time in the pursuit of things with desires that are unfulfilled, but we're trying to fulfill, right? And I think that is something that people underestimate because of status quo bias, because we all, you know, when people say things like life is unfair, at least in the UK, this is like a very common phrase. I don't know if you guys have it are you in America or Canada or?
I'm actually in the state of Nevada in the United States. I grew up in California.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is like a common phrase in the US, but in the UK, it's a common phrase you'll hear a lot. And I think
that life is unfair.
Yeah. You have this phrase, right? I mean,
I think it's actually kind of a truism. I think and I'm not sure where it wouldn't be popular or common to at least acknowledge that, you know, life isn't inherently a fair existence. There's many things about life that are not inherently fair. If not everything in existence is not inherently fair. So,
Mm.
So.
But yeah, sorry, just to round off what I was saying. I can't actually remember where I got to. Where did I?
Well, we were talking about desires that go unmet or are met, but kind of an unsatisfactory way, or we mentioned hedonic.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where I got, but I'll just sort of round that off in general. Is that when people look back on their lives, we often underestimate the amount of time that we spent with an unfulfilled desire, trying to achieve something. And just one very mundane common example is we spend, well, it depends on the person, but many people will spend much of their time hungry. Not hungry in some I'm using like a trivial example that's a sort of everyday example that like I think
it's time for lunch hungry. I'm
exactly. And the fact that it's so mundane and so trivial is one of the reasons why I think people look over it so much. But I actually think it is, it is relevant. Is the fact that we spend much of our time, desiring something, then we get it, we eat a meal, we have maybe, 10 minutes of pleasure, we feel satiated for some time, but then we go back onto the treadmill of, now I'm in need of, or I'm building up to a level of hunger that I'll need food again, etc. So I think those are sort of two categories of, there's much suffering in our lives. Often it depends on the person again, but often it is concentrated near the end of our lives. And then, although it can be throughout, if people have like depression and things like this. And then you've also got throughout our lives, we have many desires that are unfulfilled. And the ones that we do fulfill often, whatever the word is, I've forgotten it again, but
yeah. I mean, I think I get where you're coming from. In fact, part of what I think led us into contact was me asking my interlocutor on X. It wasn't you; it was a different anti-natalist. But just kind of asking the question, well, what's wrong with suffering? Because on its face, suffering's bad, right? But then there's been a lot of different responses to suffering throughout all of human history. The Stoics basically, they advised acceptance of suffering as a natural part of life. Buddhists see suffering as inherent to existence, caused by desire and attachment, but they advocate overcoming it through the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. And Christianity views suffering as a consequence of the fall of man, of human sin, and the idea of and that's a call to being, kind of forgiven from our sins. I could go down the list. Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Taoism, Sikhism. They'll have ways of reconciling suffering as not being the ultimate anti-value, but rather valuable in at least in an indirect way. That obviously pain is unpleasant. Feeling hunger is a signal. It's not necessarily something that I feel like I'm necessarily suffering when I'm hungry. Now, starvation, that's a different thing. But we were talking about kind of more commonplace. It's time for lunch, kind of hunger. That I see that more as a signal that it's going to be time to eat soon. And I think it was Douglas Adams, famous British author who I loved, wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Once quipped that humans go through the how, why, and where phase. The how phase is how do we eat. The the why phase is why do we eat, and the where phase is where shall we have lunch. And so but obviously that's kind of a softening of the kind of suffering. If you're wondering how do we eat, then you're kind of at a level of more dire need than if you're thinking about why do we eat, where you're thinking scientifically, and then where shall we have lunch, you're thinking more kind of, okay, it's just more of an aesthetic choice in some ways. So, but the suffering itself of hunger, most people would trivialize that and say, well, that, unless you're talking about true starvation, that's not really suffering. And then all these other views basically have throughout human history kind of worked to reconcile suffering with human existence. And I would say for the adherents of those views, mostly, succeeded. People view their lives as, on the large meaningful, including suffering, including things that they can't even necessarily justify from a direct kind of moral point of view. If you have a child who has a birth defect, how is that right. It's not right. At the same time, people contextualize it in a greater sense that it brings meaning to their lives, and therefore, in a sense, transmutes that suffering into meaning and to deeper purpose. And in fact, death at the end of life seems to be, contextualize everything you've done in life or accomplished in life or not accomplished in life, and gives you a reason to actually kind of introspect about the meaning of your life. And then antinatalism comes along and says, well, harm is bad in all of its forms, in its least form, its greatest form, and in the global form of humanity's inhumanity man, and as well as in its minor form. And it seems to me established this as kind of an ultimate anti-value, and then proposes a pretty, I would say, radical solution to it, which is don't have kids. So I know that's a lot I just dumped on you, so feel free to respond any way you like there.
Yeah, no, sure. I think it's it's not surprising to me that many people find meaning in suffering, and suffering can have this instrumental value, and that we as a species have I don't know if engineered is or constructed belief systems or practices that help us to overcome suffering. Like you said, Buddhism, it has things like meditation and mindfulness, and as you said, the Eightfold Path. And
well, in
none
particular,
of that,
like for example, if you take Buddha as an example, there the first of the Four Noble Truths is life is suffering, which is actually the Sanskrit word dukkha, which means it's often translated as suffering, but it's really like unsatisfactoriness or lack. So everything is slightly off, at least like it's like you can't, and it proposes a kind of understanding and detachment from that, so that we don't actually turn what is natural dukkha into suffering, which is basically an immiserated state of mind. And that's my interpretation of it. I'm not a Buddhist expert, so anyway, let's continue.
But no, it doesn't surprise me that we have constructed all these things and we have the ability to find meaning in suffering, because that is something that would make us more likely to reproduce. And so evolutionarily, it would just be a benefit to us if a species has evolved to the point where we can think about such things. If we'd evolved in such a way where we could not find meaning in from suffering, or we could not construct these sort of things,
it wouldn't be very good for the species, right?
Exactly. It wouldn't be very good for the species, because much more of them would have probably come to the conclusion that actually we shouldn't continue this. So maybe let's stop reproducing. So it's no surprise to me that, we find ourselves in a species that, given we have the capacity to rationalize things, that we have, we do that in our individual lives, and we've created structures. Unlike a wolf, for example, a wolf does not have, I just wondered, why did wolf come to mind? And then I realized who I was speaking to.
But, it's a great symbol. You can use it for all kinds of things. So go ahead.
But it's like, other species like wolves or deer or giraffes, they also suffer, but they don't have the cognitive capacity to rationalize that suffering and find meaning in it, as far as I'm aware anyway. But they also obviously don't have the cognitive ability to muse on their suffering and think, actually, well, given that there's so much suffering in life, I'm actually going to stop reproducing, right? So they don't really have it either way. Whereas we, it seems clear that given we have the capacity to think like this, it seems obvious that we would have fallen on this side of the pond. Otherwise, we would have probably stopped procreating anyway.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote by there's a fantasy author, Terry Goodkind, who said that human beings are the only species that can hate their own existence. So, so there, I think it sounds like you and I would probably agree that there is a difference in some ways between human suffering and, say, animal suffering, like an antelope that's attacked by, a lion obviously suffers, and maybe the lion suffers itself in old age, but not in the sense, kind of the self-reflective, oh, I am suffering kind of way that humans do. Would you agree with that?
I think I agree with you. I think animals, whilst I, put great, I have great concern for the suffering of animals. I do think that, not in every way, but in some ways they do suffer differently from us. The only caveat I would add to that is that we don't fully understand the experience of animals. And as humans, we are often liable to dumb down the capacities of animals as we have done in the past. So it could be the case that we find that there are certain species, maybe dolphins or orcas, maybe some other primates, maybe they do have that capacity to reflect, at least in a rudimentary way, on their own suffering.
Mhm.
But,
I agree,
that's
it's
another
probably
topic.
it's probably, and I don't want to get too much on animal suffering. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's a continuum, and I think that it's hard to say a plankton suffers when it dies, or a single-celled, animal. But it's very easy to say humans suffer because we can even communicate it and self-reflect about our suffering, and it's very obvious to us. It's not as clear that some species can be as reflective about it, but it's clear that many animals, you mentioned orca, elephants, and so on, they mourn, and so on. So and they and it's clear it's not just projection on humans that they do this. It follows patterns which we can interpret without having to have language. So I agree with that.
I just wanted to, because I haven't fully answered your question about sort of antinatalism's take on suffering. So I think obviously it would depend on the antinatalist you speak to, but for me, I completely recognize that once we exist, suffering can have instrumental value. So for example, as you said, if we get some sort of infection, this is going to hurt us. There may be some inflammation or something like this, but we can use that as a signal to, I need medical attention now. Or like you said, it's more discomfort than suffering, I guess, but the discomfort of being hungry signals to you that you need to get food. So clearly there's forms of discomfort or suffering or negative experience. The experience itself is negative, but it can have instrumental value. So I don't dispute that at all. And I actually think it's good once we exist to voluntarily, in some instances, take on suffering so that we can not acclimatize to it, but use that as a way to become a bit more, I don't know what the term is, but battle hardened, so that when there's involuntary suffering, it's not as, it doesn't impact us as negatively, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think also we would agree that, among the living, not introducing unnecessary suffering is a value, and most people hold that value. And I guess part of the question gets down to, the response being that yes, suffering is a fact. Yes, it might have instrumental value among the living, but that introduces a moral argument for then having fewer living, or introducing fewer people into existence. And but if I may, there's a few things I've read when I've been studying antinatalism that seem to me like they kind of because I want to get down to the core of what antinatalism is and understand it. But it seems to me there's a few things that come up a lot that seem like kind of distractions or deflections away from the core of antinatalism. And I want to find out if you'd agree, because this short list of things that come up, and I want to see if you think they're core to antinatalism or not, so we can have a decent shared understanding of where the root of the view lies. I mean, the first one would be, for example, death itself, because you would agree with me, like you said, that a plankton dying is not suffering necessarily. And so that it's not death itself that is immoral, because it's lots of things die that don't suffer, and so it's actually the suffering that matters, not death. So if you say we're all subject to death in the end, well, that's true for every living thing, not just things. So it really doesn't matter that we die. What matters is that we suffer before we die, or that we suffer during existence. Would you say that that's an agreeable point?
I've got to say, because have you heard of Epicureanism?
I have heard of it. I haven't studied it directly, but yeah.
So the Epicurean take on death is that death itself isn't a harm. Obviously, dying, like the process of dying, can be a harm. If you die of cancer or something like that. But actually, being dead is not a harm to the being who has died.
Right.
So that's Epicureanism. The opposite view, that death, as well as the dying process, but death itself is a harm for someone, I don't know if there is a label for that term, but this seems like the more widely accepted view by the average person, right? They see death as something bad in and of itself. I've got to say, on this point of whether death itself, independent of the dying process, whether death itself is a harm or not for the individual who's died.
Well, actually,
Honestly,
my question
this
is
is
more about, if I may interrupt, it's not so much, my question isn't so much about is death itself a harm, but is death itself integral to the antinatalism argument? For example, if you remove death entirely,
right.
you basically said,
no, it isn't. No.
Yeah, right. And that's why I want to kind of go down this list of what I think about as kind of distractions, because,
Okay.
because, I heard you state it in one of your videos recently that it's really about the harm arises in actual procreation, in actually, bringing a person into existence. Is that a fair characterization? I mean, I think that's what I heard.
Yeah, I think the act of procreation condemns an individual to the harm that they will experience in their life. The actual act itself, of procreation, of the moment the baby sort of, well, it depends how you define procreation. If you define it as when the sort of lights come on in the womb, or when they actually are born. Either way, that experience, I don't know if being born is the best experience, but none of us remember it, right? But it's not that instant is where the harm is accrued, although there may be some in some cases. It's that is the point at which that is the morally relevant, how to phrase it. That's the point at which the moral condemnation of the act really kicks in. Right. Before you create the person, it's something you're still considering. It's once you've created the person, that's when the moral condemnation comes in, and where the sort of ethical concern is. Yeah. Because obviously, once someone exists, they exist. So obviously, we have to treat it's a completely different question.
The horse is out of the barn, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. The horse is out of the barn. So antinatalism is no longer relevant in any way, apart from the fact that obviously an antinatalist would want to convince that person not to continue and create another person. But in terms of how that person is concerned, I mean, they're already here, so they've got to live their life, hopefully improve, the situation of others. But
right. But I wanted to make sure that we agree that death isn't an integral part of the antinatalism.
No, exactly.
Itself.
Yeah.
Even if death as death,
yeah.
not death as suffering or death as a mournable loss or anything like that, but death as death itself, because lots of people die that don't suffer.
Yeah, it's not integral to antinatalism, but it is often referenced because if you view death as a harm, that is one of the harms that you will be imposing on someone. But that's just one of them. It's not integral. There are many other.
Well, like things, I say, the simple fact that things die that don't suffer, implies that if you remove death from the equation, antinatalism still is an argument. So. And so, because if all that existed was plankton, if you were somehow a disembodied mind, you wouldn't necessarily say that plankton dying is a bad thing because they don't suffer, because suffering is the value I think you're trying to protect here. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. It's beings that have the capacity to suffer are the beings that antinatalists are concerned with when coming into existence. Yeah.
Okay. So the second distraction I see coming up a lot is the environment. That there's a fundamental argument for antinatalism. It doesn't really rely on scale, the number of humans in existence, the carrying capacity of the earth, the degradation to the environment or the climate or whatever. You could remove all that. We could have abundance of everything, a beautiful planet and so on. But as long as you have one person who's suffering, it doesn't matter if the climate's not affected at all. There's still an argument for antinatalism. Is that correct?
Yes, I also very muchly advocate against talking about antinatalism in environmental terms. I think it gets very complicated. I don't think it's the strongest argument. Some people, that is their wheelhouse and that's all they talk about. But I stay away from the environmental topic. I think it's a distraction as well. So
okay, I'm trying to find our points of common agreement.
Yeah.
And obviously, somebody else who feels more strongly about that can defend that point of view. But, I want to find where we agree on so we can really kind of narrow down where we might disagree and how to understand that. The third distraction I see is like quality of life. Like some people lead dreadful lives while others lead relatively good ones. But if suffering is endemic to all lives, then the variance of quality of life is not really is kind of a distraction from the core argument that part of living is suffering. So at least for sentient beings. And so the quality of life, if I could say, I could guarantee that all people would have quality of life, but there's still death, and there's, but the fact that some people lead particularly dreadful lives isn't itself integral to the antinatalist argument. Is that correct?
I think there's just one. So I agree. Even if everyone had like,
if you could raise everybody on the planet to Western high levels of,
exactly,
of affluence and quality of life and leisure
yeah,
and so on, there would still be an argument for antinatalism.
Yes, there would. The only caveat I would add to that, though, is that the worse someone's quality of life is, the greater the harm is of them coming into existence.
Mm-hmm.
So the quality of life is almost like the dial of how bad the action is, if you get what I mean.
Sure.
So it's like antinatalism says this action is bad, but it's it's how bad the life is going to be, but will turn up the magnitude.
Yeah, but to use your dial analogy, it sounds like it has a detent at off, which is non-existence, and then you click it, and then now you exist. And now it's not a matter of no suffering; it's a matter of maybe minimal suffering up to maximal suffering. But as soon as you click it past that detent, you've turned it on, you've turned life on, and there's suffering, and therefore the argument for antinatalism kicks in. So it's not really a matter where that dial is set, as long as it's set anywhere but off. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that is fair. So for antinatalists, obviously they view procreation as bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a categorical thing, but within that category, there's a range of how bad it is, and the quality of life is what determines where on that range that individual case would lie. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And similarly, like the economics or sociopolitics of raising children, the circumstances of whether you happen to be born in an affluent country or during a good time or bad time or during a war or whatever, even again, if you could guarantee that all children were born into a wonderful, country in a wonderful place in history and so on, that still wouldn't, defeat the antinatalism argument, because, the whole point of coming to existence being a kind of root harm, and the suffering involved in existence and so on would leave the antinatalism argument in place. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last one I had was the how having children affects personal freedom and sovereignty. This is often raised as, well, if you don't have children, you have more time, you have more money, you have more income, and of course I'm personally, I chose to have 2 kids with my former wife, with my ex-wife, and then there was about a 10-year interregnum, and then I got remarried to a woman who never wanted kids, never had kids, we're never going to have kids, and we're very happy, but I had my kids, and they're doing okay, thankfully, and which wasn't guaranteed, and so, people make autonomous choices about whether, when to have kids, whether bringing kids into the world should be a good thing to do, for themselves, completely apart from the moral argument that having kids itself is a harm. And so, that how it affects your personal freedom and autonomy it also is not core to the antinatalist argument. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
All right. So having gone down that kind of list of, what I keep seeing as kind of distractions, we've got it down to antinatalism is the harm caused by the either choice or maybe ignorant action of bringing kids into existence, because kids are accidents too, and that still has the same effect. So it's not a matter whether you choose to have children, it's whether or not children come into existence. And I think we both agree that coming into existence is something that happens. The question is, now we layer a moral kind of judgment on top of that. Does that sound fair?
Yeah. That ultimately is what antinatalism is. Yeah, it's a moral judgment on coming into existence. Yeah.
Okay. So, where I'm want to go with that now is that, I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm a lay philosopher. I teach critical thinking. I wrote some software that helps people do critical thinking and strategic planning. But so good thinking is important to me. And so when I talk to people who are trying to do strategic planning or, kind of understand root causes of problems, I'm very used to asking very kind of logical, methodological questions. And I understand it can sound a bit lawyerly at times. That's not my intent, but it's a value to me that the statements I make and the beliefs I hold them, to as the best thing I've encountered so far. I like to think that I'm open to the criticism of any of my beliefs, no matter how fundamental they seem to me. But obviously some of them I think are more likely to be true than others. Like, for example, that you and I exist as independent entities, and that I'm really talking with you. I'm not a brain in a vat, and so on. Those are, kind of properly basic beliefs that it's hard to refute, because then, you descend into madness. Other things like, whether, say, Christianity is true. I'm not a Christian. I'm a non-believer, but, I used to be a Christian. So, but I understand these kind of systems of thought. I've studied a little Buddhism, but I'm not a Buddhist. My own beliefs, are a mix of things, that I found to be the best I've come across, and I've kind of tested them in my own life and found them to be satisfactory for now, but I'd like to think that all my beliefs are held provisionally. I don't know how you feel about antinatalism as a belief yourself. If, and I'm not going to try to move you off that spot necessarily in this conversation, but I do have a question about the kind of root belief, which is that, as you put it, like, bringing somebody into existence is a harm. And the problem I have with that is that I see that statement itself as fundamentally incoherent. And I don't mean that as in a derogatory way. I mean, in kind of a logical way. In that that when you talk about, when I say incoherent statements, I mean a statement like, I write software for a living. I don't know if you have any tech background, but if you've ever written any programs, you understand you have variables that say A equals 1, right? And to say, for example, I removed the variable from my program, then I incremented it. It's like, okay, that makes no sense. You can't remove something from your program and then increment it like it exists. A non-existent thing cannot be affected or incremented. Or, for example, to say a square circle has uneven sides. Well, that's obviously self-contradictory. So it's not true or false. It's not even wrong. It's just incoherent. To say something like the taste of nothingness is bitter. It's like, okay, nothingness has no attributes. It has no taste. It has no smell. It has no appearance. It cannot suffer. Nothingness is nothingness. It's incoherent to assign attributes to it. And something I keep coming up in the antinatalism argument is the idea that coming into existence is a harm. The problem I have with that is that harm as a concept implies something that can be harmed, that preexists. If I, stabbed you right now, I'd be harming you, but you exist. And the coming into existence of is what causally needs to presuppose harm. And to say that coming to existence or bringing somebody into existence is a harm implies that they exist in this kind of platonic world of no harm, no suffering, no pain, that is kind of, this existence that precedes existence. But if you don't grant that there's this platonic world, and I think in the Pixar movie Soul, they called it the Yosemite world. The souls are before they're introduced to Earth. If you don't grant the existence of something like that, then it seems to me logically incoherent to say that bringing something into existence is suffering. You can say bringing something into existence happens for sure, but then to start associating qualia with it, like it's a harm, seems to me it commits a fallacy of using a concept using a concept to undermine the concept. It's sometimes called the fallacy of the stolen concept. So I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, when at least when I say that I think coming into existence is a harm, I guess it's sort of shorthand for saying that I think creating someone and bringing them into existence, although bringing even itself is not the best term, because to bring someone into existence, you have to bring them from somewhere, right?
To bring somebody into a house, they had to be outside the house first.
Exactly. So I guess the best word is to create someone. So when you create someone, that person is inevitably going to experience some harm, right? Now,
well, once they exist, they're certainly capable of suffering harm. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And this is what antinatalists are referring to when they say coming into existence is a harm. In the same, and I don't think it's incoherent to talk about a future being that could exist, even if they don't exist at the moment. We do this all the time. It's very common. If you use the example of, say, climate change, right? Now, obviously, climate change is a very divisive topic, but I don't know what your views are on it, but for the sake of this conversation, let's just assume that the climate change is happening, and the projections that we generally hear are sort of roughly accurate, right?
Well, we'll take that for argument's sake for now. Go ahead.
Exactly, for argument's sake, right? Just for the purposes of this conversation, hypothetically.
Yep.
Even though future generations that will be impacted by our current actions, in that we pollute the environment, or we cause climate change to become to be worsened, right? Future generations will be the victims of those actions, even though those future generations don't exist today, right?
Sure.
And it doesn't seem to me incoherent to be concerned with the suffering that we could cause someone who doesn't exist yet or could exist in the future. Because once someone decides that they are going to create someone, then it's just a matter of time, right? And so to me, it doesn't really, the fact that they don't exist now doesn't seem to me to make it difficult to speak about the harms that will be caused to them by their coming into existence, because we know that our actions in that the action that we decide to create someone, even though that person doesn't exist now when we make that action, they're going to we make that decision, they're going to exist in 9 months, or less than 9 months if we're talking about they come online during pregnancy.
Sure.
That to me doesn't seem to disqualify talking about that person and how our actions will impact them, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I do get what you mean. In fact, we started out this conversation talking about how, we both, now that we're here, we'd like to leave a better place for the people who come after us. And this is something that politicians talk about, what kind of world we're going to be leaving our children, and therefore we should have these kinds of policies or whatever. What kind of societal standards should we have because we want our children to be happy and so on. And I think that's completely rational and fair and natural from a human nature point of view, is to we, as they say, we all want our children to have a better life than we had. At the same time, I feel like that statement also has wrapped up in it the presupposition that we are expecting future generations, that we want future generations, that we are committed to the welfare of future generations. Whereas antinatalism would seem to undermine that. And the idea is you personally, I'm going to use you as an example, but maybe this doesn't perfectly apply to you, but you personally are not committed to future generations because you feel like they would suffer. And so the inevitability of suffering basically means that from an antinatalist, and again, if I'm mischaracterizing, please correct me, from an antinatalist perspective, that you're not committed to the welfare of future generations. You're actually ideologically committed to no future generations. And to do that, you can't really, you're not really then qualified to talk about what would be best for them, because they won't exist in your ideal world, in your ideal end state. So that seems to undermine and make incoherent the kind of the duty of care kind of argument from an antinatalist perspective.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly the phraseology you used. Did you say my commitment to future generations?
Right. Well, so the idea of it's not unfair to think about the future welfare, the welfare of future generations, or the people who are yet to be born. Okay, so it's common to think about the people who are yet to be born as being affected by our actions. At the same time, I'm personally committed to, I'm unabashedly team human, as Elon Musk would say, and I think that, human flourishing is important to me, but it wouldn't be important to me if I weren't committed to more humans being in existence. So,
right.
So
yeah. Well, I think personally, I think you can hold those two things simultaneously. I mean, when I think that the term was used, said, I'm not committed to future generations, and it's sort of like that. I think that is a bit ambiguous. I'm not committed to creating future generations, but given that future generations will exist, they are obviously going to be morally relevant individuals, and I have concern for morally relevant individuals. I don't think that we should be creating any, but given that they are here, or they will be here, I think that we should make their lives go as well as possible. For example, you could say, I don't think we should be creating situations where there will be refugees, but given that there are going to be situations where there are refugees, I have concerns for those individuals. And so I'm going to try and, ameliorate their situation or make their lives go better, if you get what I mean.
Right.
I don't have an interest.
I'm personally not committed to more refugees. Okay. So, obviously, my worldview doesn't say, well, there ought to be more refugees so we can protect them, but my worldview personally does say, well, I'm committed to future generations so we can nurture them and make a better world for them and so on, because I think that, I would guess my view, I would call responsible natalism, the idea being that if you're going to have kids, do it right.
Yeah.
And that, it is a serious responsibility being a parent, and there's no perfect parent, and there's no perfect time to have kids. But if you're going to do it, we should be encouraging standards of ethical standards and standards of care that basically say that, we want kids that are good, and we want kids to be put into a good world, and the imperfections of parents, kids, and the world is not a refutation of that idea. So in that sense, I'm committed to the welfare of future generations because I expect and want future generations. Whereas you might expect future generations, but do you want future generations? Because you seem committed to the idea that no matter what we do, they're going to be subject to this, infinite anti-value of suffering.
Yeah, I would say I'm committed and not committed. I'm not committed to creating them, but given that they are going to come into existence, even though I haven't been part of bringing that about, I'm given that they are going to come into existence, I'm committed to their, however you want to phrase it, to their welfare or making their lives go better in whatever humble way I can as an individual. I don't see any incongruity there in not wanting to create people but also recognizing that there will be people created, and therefore I have concern for them, just like I have concern for my next door neighbor or you as another individual. It doesn't really matter to me that you exist now and someone isn't going to exist until 5 years' time. I still have concern for both of you. I think it would be better if that person didn't come into existence in 5 years' time. But given that I know that they very likely will, I'm going to have concern for them just as I have concern for you as someone, that also exists on this planet.
So this strikes me as maybe another thing that I see as, it's brought up in connection with the antinatalist argument, but it's not really core to it, because the idea is that you're saying that, as long as people are going to come into existence, you support the idea of having a better world for them to come into existence, which we agree on. And yet, if you take that away, I would say that, not having future generations is, well, it could be a thing. We could destroy ourselves and not have future generations, and I don't want that, At the same time, if you look on balance, of the suffering in the world, if we destroy ourselves this generation, which would be equivalent of everybody suddenly becoming antinatalist, not having kids, and then we go extinct, that would reduce the net suffering in the world. And it would seem from your priors that would be a net good thing, whereas I wouldn't consider it to be a net good thing. Is that fair? Because I'm committed to the welfare of future generations, and I would say that even though you say you can hold both in your mind, they're really different things. It's a category error, because you're saying that as long as people are here, I'm all for, go team human, but I'd rather people not be here. Whereas, and that kind of undermines the whole thing. Basically, you'd rather not have to be on team human, but it's your second choice. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess so. I am going to have to get to grips with referencing it as team human. Yeah, the way I would phrase it is that I think it would be preferable if we didn't bring any more beings into existence. But given that we will, I recognize that they will be morally relevant, and I have concern for morally relevant individuals. I know I've said it in that way before, but I'm not really sure how else to say it. I just don't.
It's the given that we will part that I think is not core to antinatalism. I think that you're basically saying that given that we will, we need to make a better world, but you take away the given that we will, and antinatalism still stands as an argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So when I was expressing those views, I was expressing them as my views, not that they were inherent to antinatalism. I think antinatalism specifically just focuses on the question of whether we should bring new individuals into existence. The fact that new individuals who are in existence, we should help them, that's more of a sort of like an argument for philanthropy. That's a separate sort of moral argument. It's just I couple them. It's like you have different moral beliefs. I have a variety of moral beliefs. It's sort of like so they're independent, but I often reference them in the same conversations because they're relevant to each other. But no, the concern for people who will come into existence, that's not an inherent part of antinatalism. You could be an antinatalist, and absolutely hate people and not want to help anyone. I think
I've seen some pretty nihilistic and pessimistic statements from antinatalists on X, and
exactly, there's a variety.
It's like you read what they say and they're like, it's like, it's hard to imagine being this person's friend, Whereas I can imagine being your friend because, we're having a reasonable conversation about a topic we don't agree on. And I want more civil conversation between people who don't agree. But yeah, I mean, just the idea that in this conversation, I really, like I say, I want to stick with the core of the antinatalist argument, which, as I've said, I think is logically incoherent. And therefore, I'm not saying it's ultimately wrong, because when you can say that something is not even wrong, it's like, well, you may have refuted it, you may not have, but then it comes down to a matter of faith. Because if you believe that bringing people into existence is a moral wrong, then that's fine. If you think you can defend that logically, then that basically means you can't make incoherent statements to do so. And if you can't not make incoherent statements to do so, then you have to admit, well, it can't be defended logically. It just feels right, or natalism boo, as opposed to natalism is actually wrong. And whereas, I'm not trying to say that having kids is right. I'm not a natalist. I would say that like I said, if I put myself in a category, I'd say I'm a responsible natalist. That is, I think kids are generally a good thing. That's been proven by the fact that that throughout human history, kids are considered good, and that's so anybody who says, well, kids are bad, the kind of burden of proof is on them, I would say. And also that suffering is not necessarily bad, because I think history shows that suffering has, as you put it, a lot of utilitarian purposes, at least. And so the idea of to condemn suffering universally, the burden of proof is on the person making that assertion. That's the more odd assertion. And so
I actually just wanted to circle back to that because I didn't finish what I was saying originally, when how sort of antinatalism relates to suffering. So there are sort of two parts to this. The first part is that whilst I said before, and we agree on this, is that suffering can have instrumental value once someone exists. The instrumental value seems to me like an odd thing to want to create someone for. So, for example, given that I exist, it makes sense for me to, go to the gym, take on some, discomfort, and even, suffering. Some people may say you have to go through suffering. Since I was 14,
I'm very into lifting weights. So yeah,
exactly. So it makes sense once I exist to go through some suffering, some discomfort in the gym, in pursuit of the instrumental value that it brings, which is strength, commitment, being able to. The fucking word's gone from my head. Can I swear?
Oh yeah. You totally.
Yeah, the word's gone from my head. Not perseverance, but you get what I mean. It's a
right, absolutely. Well,
a word like that.
People often believe that certain kinds of, especially suffering of choice, can build character. So and in the case of lifting weights, you build strength, you build resilience, you build utilitarian value of
discipline. That was the word I was looking for.
There you go, discipline. Yeah, it's a great word.
Yeah,
go on.
So yeah, I think that completely makes sense once you exist. But for me to say that I'm going to create someone so that they can go to the gym to build strength, well, that to me makes no sense, because that person doesn't exist to need or be benefited by that strength. So that it would be like saying I'm going to create someone so that they can have a nice retirement is a common sort of example antinatalists give. Like, once we exist, it's good, obviously, to have a nice retirement, but it doesn't make sense to create someone so they can.
Yep.
So I think that the instrumental value of suffering doesn't really have any relevance when we're considering creating someone. And so imposing the suffering on someone by creating them, and you can't appeal to the instrumental value, seems to me like you're just imposing suffering on someone then.
Okay, so
sorry, go on.
I want to make sure you finish your point. I don't want to jump in.
And then the second thing is that when you create someone else, you're imposing the suffering on someone else. This isn't voluntary suffering you're bringing. You're voluntarily taking on yourself. This is something you are imposing on someone else. And generally, in pretty much any other situation that we can consider, people are generally against imposing suffering on someone else unless that suffering is in some way going to stave off a greater suffering. So pushing someone out the way so they didn't get hit by a van. But obviously, before someone exists, they're not at risk of any harm. So that you couldn't really appeal to that as a sort of as a get out clause, if it were. But yeah, sorry, that's my.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as a kid, I remember there was an American performance artist named Laurie Anderson. You probably never heard of her, but
no,
she was big on the college radio circuit when I was a kid, and I listened to a lot of college radio growing up. But she did a song called "Born Never Asked," and it's mostly an instrumental song, but it opens up with a short reading. I just pulled it up here. It was a large room full of people, all kinds, and they had all arrived at the same building at more or less the same time, and all of them were free. And they were all asking themselves the same question: what is behind that curtain? You were born, and so you're free. So happy birthday. And I always thought, how that's very profound. And then the song proceeds, and it's a violin song. It's very kind of, it's a very, well, I just recommend go listen to "Born Never Asked" by Laurie Anderson. It's a very moving song, but that's the only words in it is at the very beginning. And that always struck me because it's not really condemning or even celebrating life. It's just acknowledging life. It's not saying it's wrong that you were born. It's it happened that you were born. And it's the people already in existence acknowledging you being born and you're being free in the sense of now you're here. What are you gonna do now? And it seems to me that what you're describing is, I would call, the argument from non-consent. That generally it's very important to because we're free and because we have basic human liberties, that before we do something to somebody, we acquire their consent. And if we don't do that against somebody's consent, then that's a moral wrong. And you and I as free beings, again, if I stabbed you or did something terrible to you, that would be probably without your consent. So, and therefore wrong. But it seems to me that, again, when we get back to the idea of kind of bootstrapping existence by procreation, we're entering the area of a category error, where because we're non-existence doesn't have the attribute of being able to do harm to it. So when you say that we're not getting the consent of the person to be brought in, there's no person to get the consent of. Yes. And so the best you can say that happens is the person comes into existence, not that they came into existence without consent, because even the idea that they can consent is incoherent because they don't exist. Once they exist, the idea of a person, for example, children, we don't consider to be able to give legal consent.
Yes.
To medical procedures, to certain kinds of things, we don't consider them to be competent to stand trial as adults. If there's a crime involved or something like that, because we don't consider them able to consent. So if we don't consider children able to consent, why would we consider non-existent entities to be able to consent? That's not even wrong as it would be with children, but it's incoherent in that you can't assign attributes like ability to consent to things that don't exist.
Yeah. So that this is a very sort of common, as I see it, misunderstanding. It's not that we, as an antinatalist, when you make the consent argument, which is obviously only one argument for antinatalism, but when someone talks about consent, they're not saying that there is some sort of that non-existence itself has this quality of being able to or not being able to get consent from them. It's that to create someone, it requires you to impose harm on them without being able to get their consent, right?
Yeah, well, I would say it sounds clear to me to say that existence entails suffering, or existence entails harm, because if you consider that, and so it's inevitable we're going to suffer some kind of harm at some point. I tend to think of harm as a volitional thing as opposed to suffering, which is more just a fact. But coming into existence entails suffering or
Yeah.
harm if you want, but or I would say existence entails that, but coming to existence is a separate thing, because coming to existence implies that there was this thing that didn't exist, and that itself is an incoherent statement. There was this thing that didn't exist. It's like saying I met a man on the stair, who wasn't there.
I think that's just a failure of the English language. Coming into existence is more just a short form way of saying it, if you get what I mean. I think that's just a failure of the English language, but we can maybe say, if we just refer to it as the creation of someone else, to create someone else, you clearly have to do it without their consent, because you can't get consent from someone who doesn't exist. And in pretty much
to create someone else, you have to do it without their consent. Their consent implies they already exist. So you're right. It might be a failure of the English language, but it seems to me that what you have to end up saying is, to create an existence, you have to acknowledge that they probably will suffer, and that that, because they probably will suffer, they refers to as after they exist, whereas to do it without their consent, that they is a prior they that exists before you do something to them, because consent implies
I don't think so. I think
later state.
When I say to create someone, you can't get their consent. When I say there, I'm talking about the person who you will create. So I'm talking about someone who will exist. The fact they don't exist now, I don't think we have to change the language. I understand the language can trip people up, but I don't think it necessarily implies that we're talking about non-existence as they, if you get what I mean.
Sure. Well,
we're just talking about a future being as if I'm talking about a future generation. I would say they will come into existence in 50 years' time. They don't exist now. I'm not talking about non-existence as a they. I'm just referencing they as in the person who will come into existence.
Right. Well, so, right. And so a person saying the person who will come into existence, it's like, okay, so look, to sum up my view, I mean, languages are symbolic systems. We don't write them like mathematical equations, but we do kind of manipulate them, in ways that we feel like are a lot more or less logical. And you said, it might be a failure of the English language, and you're right. It might be there's this true concept that cannot be expressed in the English language, but it also might be that the concept itself is not coherent. And so, if there's better ways of stating it, in the English language or any language, I think it would be incumbent on the antinatalist to make those statements more careful, because in the common arguments I hear for antinatalism, these what I would think of as evident incoherent statements are frequently made, and if they're just glosses for things that are more important, I'd say it's really important to it's like, how do you describe how do you describe racism without referring to race? It's like, well, how do you describe existence without referring to existence? It's like, how do you is there a valid concept of pre-existence or post-existence? When somebody on X says, I wish I were never born, is that somehow stating that I would be happier if I were never born? Because if I were never born, I can't have the attribute of happiness or sadness. And so I think that people often don't think about that. They might say, now that I exist, I'm miserable. Okay, that's true. That could be true for some people. And they could say, they could say, some people could say, I regret my existence. That's true. But I wish I'd never been born is maybe a more dramatic way of putting the same thing. I regret my existence. But the idea that I wish I'd never been born is incoherent, whereas I regret my existence is not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So just going back to what we were talking about before about, you can't get consent from them. I don't necessarily think that is a failure of the English language in its use. I just think people often misunderstand whether they is being applied. But if we want to use language that isn't going to confuse people, we could say consent cannot be gained to create an individual. That to me doesn't seem like it really trips up over any.
Well, that's true. I would agree with that statement.
Any language, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, consent cannot be gained because consent is not an applicable concept, and so. Well, I would say, because if consent is applicable, then it has to be gainable. If it's not gainable, then it's not applicable.
I don't think so. I think there are other situations where you can't gain consent from someone, and yet it's morally relevant that you can't get consent from them. So, for example,
if I pick up a rock by the lakeshore and throw it into the lake, obviously the rock did not consent, but nor does the rock have the ability to consent. So it's not applicable.
Yes, but the rock is not a morally relevant entity. But if we use the example of something like, someone's at a party and they are they're unconscious. They've taken, whatever they've taken, and they are unconscious. In that moment, when you want to, everyone knows the example I'm using here. I don't want to use the words in case it gets censored on YouTube. But if someone wants to, some unsavory act on that person, in that moment to commit that act, it's impossible for them to get consent from that individual. That individual is unconscious. There is no way of ascertaining whether or not that person would consent to that if they were conscious.
Right. I think understood that in their existence, they are already a moral agent capable of giving consent. And whereas, for example, if that person were a child, it wouldn't matter if they were awake or asleep, if they were totally awake, because we recognize that from a moral perspective, children cannot give consent to certain acts. And therefore, if children cannot give consent to certain acts, which is still a coherent statement to the idea that something non-existent, that consent must somehow be acquired from something that's non-existent, that actually enters the realm of incoherence.
No, it's not. I don't think the best way to phrase it is saying consent must be gained, because consent can't be gained. The point is that given that consent can't be gained, we should not be imposing the harm on someone. Like in other examples where you can't gain the consent, like the example I just gave of someone passed out on a sofa at a party. I think there are categories of people, such as children, but there's also people with severe learning difficulties who cannot in really any meaningful way give consent for things. They may not be the best judge of what is actually in their best interests. There are many people like this, also like maybe elderly people with dementia, for example.
Right.
I think there are two things to say here. The first thing, in terms of we judge them not to be able to give consent in any meaningful way, but we still take actions on their behalf.
Yes.
The first reason, I think, is pure practicality. Like, if we don't do that, these people, children, elderly people with dementia, people with learning difficulties, they will live extremely bad lives because they won't be able to function. Children don't necessarily, for example, know, or people with extreme learning difficulties know how to, for example, wipe their ass after they've gone to the toilet. And if they don't do that, then obviously an infection is going to happen and they could ultimately die from it. So in one way, it's just a matter of practicality. But the other thing to say is that in those cases, we are in general, when I say in general, I'm pretty much all the cases I can think of. We sort of waive their consent or waive their ability to give consent or give consent on their behalf for things that are going to stave off greater harm. So the classic example is a child cannot consent to a medical operation.
That's right.
But we give them a vaccination for, let's say, measles or whatever, or, whatever serious disease, knowing that it will impose some harm on them. No kid likes getting an injection.
No,
but we know that it's
themselves can be problematic.
That's true. But for the sake of this argument, but we know that harm is being imposed, and we're technically violating their consent there because they can't give it, because we know that it's going to be in their best interest in the future and stave off greater harm, most likely.
Well, we hope it's in their best interest at least.
Exactly. It's expected to be in their best interest, and it's expected to stave off greater harm, because if they do get the disease in the future and they don't have the vaccination, then it's either likely going to be much worse, or if they get the vaccination, maybe they just won't get it at all in some cases. The same is with we often make children against their will, not against their will in terms of hold them down, but we strongly encourage them to eat their vegetables, even when they often may not want to. And we know it's because they don't understand really their best interests. And we also know that it will stave off a greater harm. If they don't have vitamin C, they may get scurvy, etc., etc. This isn't the case with beings who we could bring into existence, right?
Well, I mean,
Because
again, the idea of beings that we could bring into existence itself, I would argue, is incoherent.
Okay, so I'll rephrase it. This doesn't apply to the case where we're considering creating someone, because non-existence doesn't, it's non-existence. There's no individual.
It has no attributes.
Exactly. There's no individual that would be at the risk of greater harm. And so to impose the harm of existence once we've created them, but again, we can't really appeal to staving off a greater harm.
I'm going to parse your words very carefully here, because this is where I see that trap of getting, to impose something implies something on which something can be imposed. And so even right there, you run afoul of that. And again, you can say it's a failure of the English language, but I would say it's actually a failure of the concept, because when
it's the imposition happened. Yeah, sorry, go on.
When you say the to impose something implies you're imposing on something that exists. And like if I pick up a rock by the lakeshore and throw it in, I've imposed being thrown into the lake on the rock. But the question is, but the rock exists. So, and whether or not it's moral or not doesn't matter. It's not even applicable. In this case, there is nothing to impose upon.
Well, no, the imposition happens once the person is in existence. So maybe a more accurate way of saying it is, we will be imposing suffering on an individual once we've created them, but we cannot appeal to staving off a greater harm to impose that on the being, if you get what I mean. So the imposition happens once they exist.
Right. So
it's just recognizing that that's going to happen.
But Antinatalism decries the act of procreation, and it seems to me that the act of procreation in itself, because it's about bringing, to use the colloquial, bringing people into existence. Basically creating new beings who didn't exist before, who had no attributes before, because non-existence has no attributes, is itself also, it's not something that's morally judgeable. Now, you can judge people for all kinds of moral things after people are in existence. You can decry the fact that the universe entails suffering, that existence entails suffering. You can say that's bad. But the mere act of procreation, I think this is kind of gets to my root of my problem with antinatalism, is not something that you can say is inherently bad, because to do so, you have to attribute, you have to assign attributes to non-existent entities, which is logically incoherent.
But I think,
and that's why I arrive at my position, which is responsible natalism, which is basically, nobody consents to being born, but nobody is able to consent to being born. And yet, the universe, is so constituted that people come into existence, and that itself, the coming into existence of the universe itself, or people, or of the world, or whatever, is not morally good or bad. It's not morally anything. It just is. And then now what we do with our minds, with our societies, with our laws, and so on, is emergent from that existence, and then we can start assigning, deontological, right and wrong, shouldn't, statements about it. But the idea of coming into existence, whether it's the Big Bang, bringing the whole universe into existence, or the creation of the planet, or the evolution of species, or the suffering of an antelope that's killed by a lion, or whatever, these things, or a lion having lion cubs, these things are all morally, it's incoherent to speak about them as moral, good or bad, by itself.
Yeah, I agree with that, but that last part, when you talk about the Big Bang and lions and stuff, but that's because none of those acts of creation are done by a moral agent. So when we're talking about humans, we are talking about moral agents who can think about the implications of their actions, and we can hold them morally accountable for the actions they take. So, for example, if someone abuses a dog or kicks a dog, we can hold that individual morally accountable. But we wouldn't hold a lion morally accountable for eating a zebra, right? Because lions don't have the capacity to think about the implications of their actions morally. That's why humans are unique in that instance, that we can morally condemn or morally congratulate their actions. Talking about what you were saying before about how it doesn't make sense to cast a moral judgment on procreation. Not
other from a position of faith, because it can't be defended logically, because to do so is incoherent. So if you want to hold it as a tenet of faith, which would put antinatalism more in the realm of a faith system than I would say a philosophical system. Or at least you have to say, procreation boo, and basically just kind
Okay.
of put an incoherent moral judgment on it.
Okay, I want to delve into this further. I want to give you a case of a procreative act that I would assume you will probably have the same moral judgment of as me.
Sure.
And then I want to ask why your judgment of that is faith-based, which presumably it would be given what you've just said. So
sure.
If we give an example of, I mean, there are many different examples that would fit into a category like this, but if we just pick a very simple one, there's a couple, they are considering having a child, but they go to a medical clinic beforehand to get to get a scan to see if they carry any hereditary diseases. And it turns out that they actually both do carry a hereditary disease, which hasn't manifested in them, but given they both carry it, it's extremely likely, we're talking 99% or above, that the child will have that. And it's a hereditary disease that will mean that child has quite a short and pretty horrendous existence. I think pretty much everyone, including me, and I would assume you, probably says that that couple should not procreate for moral reasons. Would you agree with that judgment?
I'll answer with one word, and you can tell me when you're ready to expand. But yes, I would agree that would be inadvisable from a moral point of view for that couple to procreate. And I'm happy to go into what I think is the problem with that argument. But I want to make sure you've been heard on this.
Yeah, no, and just following up from that, I just wanted to ask: do you think that moral judgment is faith-based, or if it is based on something else?
Well, okay. So first of all, this when I say that procreation itself, just as such, is not something that you can judge morally. That doesn't mean specific acts of procreation. For example, rape. Okay, so rape is obviously done without consent, and it's a violent act, and therefore it is perforce immoral, and whether or not procreation happens as a result of that, that could be considered to be a tragedy, because that procreation is imposed upon the mother in that case, upon the woman.
Yeah, but that's not quite because antinatalism is concerning the individual being created, not the individual who's done the creating.
Right, but see, when you've already, so let me address your argument directly, which I would call the argument from specific tragedy, which is the idea that this couple, if they choose to procreate, they know they're doomed to have a child whose life would be very short and painful. Okay, so there's two problems I see with making that a good argument for antinatalism. One is that lifeboat scenarios, the idea of a lifeboat scenario where there's 100 passengers who need to get off a boat, and a boat that only holds 10, so who dies, right? That's not a very good basis for moral arguments.
I just want to make a quick clarification: is that I wasn't using that case as an argument for antinatalism. I was using that case to try and understand if that was faith-based or if it wasn't, and if it wasn't, why was antinatalism faith-based if that specific case isn't?
Right. So in the case of the couple who are choosing to procreate, they are. We make choices based on probabilistic, evidence all the time. With uncertain outcomes. There's a 1% chance that child might be perfectly normal, 99% chance they won't. So we make probabilistic outcomes, choices based on probabilistic evaluations all the time, and that's not faith-based. That because we have evidence and reason to think that of 100 cases like this, 99 are going to turn out this way, one's going to turn out this way. That's evidence. That's not faith. And we're not merely rolling dice. We're not merely, but we are making choices based on evidence in that case. Whereas the assertion that coming into existence is perforce a harm is actually incoherent, because it relies on assigning attributes to non-existent entities. And so
why? What? But I want to understand, why is that? Because it seems to me that case it's a rejection of that act of procreation because of the harm that's going to be imposed on the child. Antinatalism is exactly the same thing. It's just antinatalism encompasses the whole gambit of harm, whereas that is just one example on the extreme end of harm, if you get what I mean.
Right.
So I don't understand why they're fundamentally different.
Well, so as I said, the scenario you describe is on the very edges of probability. Most people don't have that kind of decision to make in their lives. Most people understand that the lives they create through procreation will have a mix of good and bad in them. And let's assume they are making a choice, because some children are had by accident. I was one such child, okay, but my parents actually they chose to parent me. So
50% of pregnancies in the world are actually unintended.
Oh, I agree. I totally get it. And one could even say that every pregnancy in the animal world is unintended, because it's pure about, right? And so they don't get together to talk about when and whether to have kids, right? They just do it, right? So so procreation happens, but the specific thing you talk about, where we have this first world medical knowledge of certain kinds of outcomes that are on the edge, essentially, they're on the ends of the bell curve, that are very rare, that are tragic in and of themselves, because a couple who actually decide they want kids, then may not be able to have them. They might consider alternatives like adoption or things like that. But they would make the sensible decision to not take that chance because it's too great a risk. Now, but unfortunately, this I think that the antinatalists commit the fallacy of composition, which is to say that the specific, it's okay to reason from the specific to the general in this case, because therefore, if this child's life is likely to be, brutally short and painful, that means since there's pain in everybody's life, then now we're justified in saying that it's wrong to have children at all, and that's the fallacy of composition. The idea that that one case, that the whole has the attributes of that one part, which is that specific tragedy, and so it seems to me like that's a weak argument at best, and probably not a good argument at all to take.
Well, I would just say I don't think that is an argument that antinatalists use. I was just using that specific case to understand this sort of the idea of antinatalism being faith-based. The rejection of procreation as a result of it resulting in lives that contain any harm or suffering, or however you want to refer to the negative, is one that rests on a specific axiology, a specific way of valuing goods and bads. And you may have, and this is one of the it's maybe the most famous argument for antinatalism. You may have come across the axiological asymmetry.
If you're still watching, odds are you're hungry for better ways to level up your thinking. I know I am, and I'm also a visual thinker. That's why I created Flying Logic, the ultimate tool for visualizing and solving complex problems. With Flying Logic, you can turn ideas into actionable plans. You can untangle the complexities to see the bigger picture, streamline your decision-making, and achieve buy-in across your team. Because it's a visual tool, Flying Logic needs to be experienced. And I want to give you 14 days to do just that. Jump over to flyinglogic.com and smash any of those bright orange buttons to get yourself a copy. Enjoy the free trial and redefine the way you approach problem solving. Now let's rejoin the conversation. Before our break, you were starting to discuss Benatara's axiological asymmetry.
Yeah, so the axiological asymmetry is essentially a way of valuing the goods and bads, the good and bad things in life from the perspective of deciding whether to create someone or not, right? So and it's important to note that this is an axiological argument rather than a logical one. So there are other arguments for antinatalism that would fall into the category of logical, but this is an axiological one. And essentially what Benatar presents is that there are some pretty fundamental and common beliefs around procreation that are widely held, and they seem to be underpinned by this axiological asymmetry he describes. But then he also sort of points out that this axiological asymmetry also results in an antinatalist conclusion. It's just that even though people hold these commonly held beliefs, which I'll go into in a minute, if it's sort of revealed to them that also actually results in an antinatalist conclusion, they often don't like that conclusion and so sort of reject it. And he says in an unfounded way.
Okay.
So if I talk about these sort of common beliefs around procreation that many people hold, that are sort of founded on this asymmetry, one of them is that it's a widely held moral belief that it is wrong to create bad lives. So we take the example of the case I just gave you, where someone knows that they will create a child that is going to live a short life, and they're going to be it's going to be a short and brutal life, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't seem to think that it is wrong to fail to create someone who would have a very good life. So on the flip side, if a couple knew that if they had a child, that child would live a long and healthy and fulfilling life, people don't morally condemn that couple for failing to create that child. If they don't create that child, well, they're simply non-existence, right? So there's no one that's been done wrong by failing to create them. So there's an asymmetry there. And the other, he describes four asymmetry.
Asymmetry boil down to, pain is bad, pleasure is good, and therefore it's
that's part of it.
Okay.
So I'll get onto it. So he describes four asymmetries that are widely held by people. I'm just going to give two as an example, but you can easily find these online if people do a Google search of the axiological asymmetry and David Benatar.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first one. The second one is that it makes complete sense to regret bringing someone into existence for their sake. In the case of someone who has a very bad life, if you create someone and it turns out they are one of these children who has a very bad life, it makes sense to say, oh, well, actually, it would have been better if I didn't create that person, if they never existed. But it doesn't make sense to say, oh, I regret not creating someone for that individual's sake, because if you fail to create someone, they don't exist. So it doesn't really make sense to say that, I regret not creating them for their sake, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's another asymmetry there, and he says that this is founded on what he calls the axiological asymmetry of harms and benefits. And the axiological asymmetry is this: it's that if X being a person exists, then the presence of the good things is good, and the presence of the bad things is bad. And again, whatever falls in those categories of good and bad may be different for the individuals. But when X never exists, so if this couple was considering creating someone and they actually decide not to create someone, if X never exists, the absence of the good things is not bad, because there's no one to be deprived of those negatives. But the absence of the bad things is actually good, even though there's no one who actively experiences that as a good. Now, what is important to say here is this is not a logical argument. So someone could say, well, I just reject this, and I say that, it's not bad that they don't have the goods, but it's not good that they don't have the bad. Someone could say that, right? But then they would have to accept the implications of that. And one of the implications would be that you have to have symmetrical versions of the asymmetrical judgment calls I just said. So, for example, when you look at the asymmetry, based on that is this asymmetry of, it's bad to create someone who has a bad life, but it's not bad to create someone who has a good life. If you take a symmetrical axiology, then it would result in you having to condemn someone for failing to bring into existence someone who they know would have a good life.
That would be kind of radical natalism. How dare you not have children?
Exactly. Now, this argument for antinatalism is probably the most well-known. I don't know if it's the most popular, because I don't think any surveys have been done. The important thing to say about it is that it isn't a logical argument. It's an axiological one. And so if someone just rejects the axiology, they're welcome to do that, but they have to take on one of the other axiologies. And then they have to consider, well, am I willing to take on board the implications of that, if you get what I mean?
I think so. I'm trying to put my finger on the issue I'm having with it, though, because it seems to me that to assert that I have to take on a different axiology implies that I am rejecting this axiology on the basis that that so you'd have to have some axiology, like like if 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 having kids is not wrong, then I have to take on a similar axiology to, well, then having as many kids as possible would be good. And the problem I'm having with what you're describing as the axiological argument is it seems like it wants to place everything on a scale from bad to good, including things that don't exist. And that's coming back to the same incoherence problem I was having. And I know you're not saying it's a logical argument, but if you're saying by axiological, it's like if you're talking about what the presuppositions of a belief system are, then in that case, if you're saying, well, these are the presuppositions of this system, then you're basically asking somebody to accept certain things on faith again. I mean, presuppositionalism is a major branch of Christianity. Not one of the biggest ones, but it's one of the main ones. That presupposes, that the Bible is the word of God and that God exists.
Yeah.
And they accept this without question. That's their axiology in this case.
Yeah.
So, and so again, I would have to question is, if you're going to make an axiological argument, are you not making an argument that antinatalism is a faith, not a philosophy or something that's logically defendable?
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that this argument is axiological, but there are others for antinatalism that aren't. The second thing to say is that I think
we're discussing this right now. And
no, I agree. I'm just saying for context. But this for this argument, I think someone can use the term faith if they want to. I think it's not the most appropriate term. But if we're talking about ethics, everyone's ethical system bottoms out at things that they simply accept as true, and they can't go any deeper. These are called axioms, right?
Or presuppositions, or essentially axioms, things that are accepted, without question because they've shown to have been shown to have utility.
Yeah. So, because they have utility, or someone may just have a deep intuitive, because when it comes to utility,
we talked about properly basic beliefs like I exist and you exist, and there's a world that exists outside. To deny that puts me into kind of a realm of solipsistic madness. So
but those are more empirical, right, than axiological, because axiological is about values, which is kind of different from empirical claims about X exists. But then it's a different thing to say whether it's good or not that X exists, if you get what I mean.
Sure. Yeah.
So I would agree with you that I wouldn't use the term faith, but I would agree with you that for any moral argument to make sense, there are certain things you have to just accept. Whether that is, I think suffering is bad or well-being is good. You can't really make arguments for things such as this. Why do you see suffering as bad? Why is suffering? Do you get what I mean? It's like everyone. Why is liberty good? I don't know. It results in people having more well-being. Well, why is well-being good? There are certain things that everyone has an ethical system that bottoms out at something.
Yeah.
So I would, if someone wants to refer to that as faith, then I would say, yes, there are some arguments for antinatalism that are based on faith or values. I would say values is a more accurate way of talking about it. But so does natalism. Like everyone's ethical values have to bottom out at something. So I don't think that's a unique. I think that's a problem for ethics generally. That's not a unique problem for antinatalism as I see it.
I have some pretty strong thoughts about that. Maybe I share them here. Because this is something that troubled me a lot in my life, and because Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, basically talked about how at some point even rationalism cannot be justified rationally. You have to make a leap of faith, as he put it. He had a contemporary, a younger man named William Bartley, who proposed an idea called pancritical rationalism. And pancritical rationalism is the basic idea that all beliefs should be held provisionally and subject to criticism, including the belief that all beliefs should be held provisionally and subject to criticism. So it basically was an attempt to avoid either a leap of faith or an infinite regress of justificationalism. And I found this to be very eye-opening when I encountered it, because it basically says that I don't have to justify my beliefs down to some kind of ground truth because there may be no ground truth, or I can justify my beliefs down to the point where I'm out of justifications. At that point, I don't have to make a leap of faith. I can just say, I'm still open to criticism. If you want to bring me a better something that actually has more value of some kind that would cause me to revise that belief, I'm open to it. Now, do I think that certain beliefs are likely to be refuted in that way? Not really, no, but it doesn't mean that I should just close my mind to any possible refutation.
I agree with that.
Yeah. And so the idea that you have to replace one axiology with another, doesn't seem to me that's necessarily true. You can say this system of thought, for example, the idea that liberty is good, is the best I've seen so far. And if you want to make a case that there's something better than liberty in terms of, how humans should manage their affairs with each other, then you're welcome to make that case. But if it doesn't stand, then I'm going to keep my priors.
I understand what you mean, but when I say that it has to bottom out at something, if someone says liberty is good, then someone's got to ask, okay, but what yardstick are you using for that?
Sure.
Why? Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's like,
well, if you look at cases where liberty's been tried, it has resulted in more. Again, you could say, well, it results in more what the Greeks would call eudaimonia, a more harmonious or society full of well-being. So, well, what's so good about that? Well, that kind of gets back to my original question: what's wrong with suffering? And again, if you want to say that suffering is bad, suffering, boo, okay, fine. But that's something that you're not prepared to defend logically. And if I say suffering not necessarily bad, then I'm not actually taking a stance on whether suffering is ultimately good or bad. I'm saying suffering exists, and there's a number of different ways people can cope with it, but it's not inherently bad. And therefore, I'm not contradicting myself. I'm not standing on the ground where I now have the burden of proof to prove that suffering is somehow good. I'm just saying suffering is. And then you can go on and add whatever, personal beliefs, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or whatever, to explain and make and transmute suffering somehow into something of value. But to start out from the prior that suffering is bad, I think you're on shaky ground, because then you basically are taking an axiom that well, at least you're taking on the burden of proof, because other people, most other people throughout history would disagree. And I think there's a lot of evidence that taking the view that suffering is inherently bad. Well, in the case of antinatalism, it would lead to extinction of the species if everybody agreed with it. And most people would not think that's a good outcome. And again, would they defend that? No, but that's the state of affairs, and that can be, I think, defended from the point of view that, if you consider the evolution to be one of the people who are one of the entities arguing at the table, well, evolution is one so far, whether it's with lower animals or, and I use that term guardedly, or humans. And then humans actually, we have the same biological drives as animals. We have a drive to procreate, and many of us, submit to that. And yeah, it can be considered to be hormonal and evolutional and evo-bio and all these things. And at the same time, it just is. It's, it is happening. It is going to continue to happen. And to somehow try to transcend that by saying, well, actually procreation is bad, it puts you in the position of either making faith-based statements or logically incoherent statements. And so while I'm not saying that it's good to have children, it's not even wrong to say it's wrong to have children. But that's my bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, my only response to that would be that if you want to refer to the rejection of procreation, as part of antinatalism as faith-based, the acceptance of procreation is equally as faith-based, I would just say. But both views will bottom out at some axiom that we just accept. They may just be different axioms.
Well, I would say based on evidence in human experience, it's the best I've found so far, is that procreation can and often is part of an enriching human experience. I want to start drawing it to a close here.
Yeah.
There's a couple more quotes I came across in my studies that I'd love to share with you, and I'll let you have the final word after that. The first quote is also by the fantasy author Terry Goodkind. He said, to exist in this vast universe for a speck of time is the great gift of life. It is our only life. The universe will go on indifferent to our brief existence. But while we are here, we touch not just part of that vastness, but also the lives around us. Life is the gift each of us has been given. Each life is our own and no one else's. It is precious beyond all counting. It is the greatest value we can have. Cherish it for what it truly is. Your life is yours alone. Rise up and live it. And the second quote is from Nietzsche. I don't know if you've ever read any Nietzsche. I like his philosophy in the main, but from his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has a small chapter, all chapters are small, called The Preachers of Death. And this is my paraphrase of one of those passages, because he's writing German originally. He said, others claim life is suffering, and they're not lying. So why not end it? Put an end to a life that's just suffering. Here's the takeaway of your teachings. Kill yourself. Get rid of yourself. Some say, desire is wrong. Let's avoid sex and not have kids. Others complain, having kids is a hassle, so why bother? You just end up with more unhappy people. They are also preaching death. So those are my two kind of closing quotes. I'd love to let you have the last word.
Yeah, sure. I would just very quickly to respond to those two quotes. The first one is that I agree that once we're here, we can be inspired and awestruck by the universe around us. And for individuals that exist, that is a good thing. And I enjoy experiencing it myself. It's just that if as individuals we never existed, there would be no one to be missing out on that or care that they don't experience that. On the Nietzsche quote, the only thing I want to pick up on is about how if someone views life as suffering, which I don't think antinatalists necessarily do, they view life as containing suffering, not necessarily entirely suffering. I don't think antinatalism has, and I'm not saying you were implying this, it's just that some people who watch this may think this. I don't think antinatalism implies a pro-death view or a pro-ending your own life view. I think once we exist, we all have a strong will to continue existing. And it's not that the bads in life are equally distributed. For many people, or most people, the bads are disproportionately at the end of one's life. And so it may make sense as an individual that you would want to continue your life given you're here, because you've built relationships, you enjoy certain things, you have ongoing projects. But it may be a rational decision that later in life, when the bads do stack up and your life does degrade and get really bad, it may then be a rational decision to voluntarily end your life. But that's another question that gets into sort of, assisted dying and stuff like that. The final thing I would say to just round things up is that I think there are a range of arguments for antinatalism. Some of them will appeal to some people, others will appeal to other people. And I think people should, at the very least, look into this subject and take it seriously, because I think probably the most important or significant ethical decision most people will make is whether they create someone or not. And I think both antinatalists and pronatalists and people in between would agree with that, and that we should all take that decision with the gravity that it has, and we should understand that it is a decision that we need to think about in an ethical and moral way. Now, I think everyone should consider it in that way. Some people will land on the antinatalist side. Most people will probably still land on the pronatalist side. But at the very least, I think everyone should be considering it in an ethical way and treating it with the significance that I think it deserves. And I'll end it there.
I think that's a great way to end it. And where can people find you?
Just my YouTube channel. It's just Lawrence Anton on YouTube.
Okay, great. And are you on X? Well, you are on X, because that's
yes. It's also just my name.
So yeah, thank you, Lawrence Anton, and I really appreciate. I'm glad. I knew we would find some broad areas of agreement, and I think we've made our areas of disagreement pretty clear. And I've considered this to be a very productive discussion. And I thank you for joining me.
No, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
Before I sign off, I want to remind you to grab that free 14-day trial of Flying Logic. I'm even throwing in Flight School Basics, the very first course in Flying Logic Academy, at no charge. Slide over to flyinglogic.com to unlock the power of strategic thinking.